Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome so many of you here on what promises to be, for once, a very pleasant and warm bank holiday weekend, and a great way to start it, I think, with the pleasure of what I know we're all looking forward to as a very interesting and challenging lecture here this evening. My name's Jonathan Wassling. Amongst other duties at the university, I'm Director of the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences, which is hosting this evening's lecture. We're of course delighted to welcome our speaker here this evening to one of our Grand Challenge lectures. The Institute here is at the heart of Keel's long-standing commitment to interdisciplinary work and research, encouraging academics and students from diverse fields across the university and beyond to nurture new ideas that cross disciplinary boundaries. And what better subject this evening to explore that interdisciplinary nature of tackling grand challenge problems. George Monbiot requires very little introduction indeed a testament to the number of people who have turned out this evening suggests that is exactly the case. He is a writer well known for his environmental and political activism. He's enjoyed a long and productive career in investigative journalism, working for the BBC, the World Service, and since 1996 he's been a regular writer for the Guardian newspaper. He's written many books. These include Poisoned Arrows and No Man's Land, based on his investigative journeys of West Papua and in Tanzania and Kenya. Also Captive State, The Corporate Takeover of Britain, The Age of Consent, Manifesto for a New World Order, and Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning. There are two collections of essays, Bring on the Apocalypse and How Did We Get Into This Mess? And in 2013, a collection of essays that really caught the imagination of many of them, for many people entitled Rewilding the Land, Sea and Human Life, one of the outcomes of which was the charity Rewilding Britain, which George has helped to found. We were just chatting actually about a shared interest and love of music, and you would have heard some music in the background as you came in. This is George's exploration into music. He hastens to add that he's not involved in the vocal aspect of that, but that would be apparently quite torturous. I'm sure that's not really the case. But this was a very interesting collaboration of an album that he produced with Ewan McLennan called Breaking the Spell of Loneliness. And this collaboration became a national tour where George and Ewan performed around Britain, turning their gigs into parties that brought strangers together in the same place. On a personal level, some of the things that George really loves are his family and friends, kayaking among dolphins, salt marshes, the exuberance of life, rock pools, ponds and ditches, insects, paleoecology, landscapes, Gavin and Stacey, and Father Ted. He also, I've highlighted this, it really stood out to me, he also loves arguments. And I have no doubt that there will be a significant level of challenge to us as individuals here this evening. I'm sure the arguments are always friendly and non-violent, but nonetheless it does suggest that George's writing and research and interaction is of a challenging nature. And that's exactly what we hope to bring out through our lecture series, our Grand Challenge lecture series in the Institute for Liberal Arts and Science, that element of challenge. In his talk tonight, George will be introducing his latest book, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis, which was published in the autumn of 2017. Here he sketches a new political history, a new political story, tailored to the needs of the 21st century, which will replace our failed models and offer a fresh and positive vision for the future. We're extremely grateful that George has been able to come and join us and speak to us this evening. Many of you will know, and he would like me to let you know that this is for his first public event since having an operation and convalescence. we're very positive, and he feels this is a very positive experience, I think you wanted me to say for that. So, but do bear with George that he still suffers some periods of tiredness. However, that being said, he's willing to engage in a question and answer session afterwards. I think that's what the chairs are for afterwards. So we're very much looking forward to that. So without further ado, I invite our Grand Challenge lecturer this evening, George Monbiot, to come and speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and thank you all for coming. As Theresa May would say, it's great to be back in Manchester. The question I get asked most often is why don't I despair? Given that my job basically involves rolling in the excrement of humanity, and I'm not just talking about my recent encounter with Piers Morgan, how do I get out of bed in the morning? And the fact is that sometimes I do. I mean, when you're faced with the extraordinary series of crises that confront us, it's often hard not to. The ecological crisis. One of my frightening realizations last year is that climate breakdown, and I call it climate breakdown because climate change sounds like calling an invading army unexpected visitors, such a ridiculously neutral and bland term for what we face. Climate breakdown is only the third of the most urgent environmental issues. And it's not to say it's become any less urgent, far from it, but I realize that there are two others which are proceeding even faster, which are the ecological cleansing of both the land and the sea by the food industry. Almost a complete sieving and destruction of life forms throughout both land and sea. Then there's the economic situation that we face, where we see this escalating, snowballing of what Thomas Piketty calls patrimonial capital. Slightly misleadingly, I feel it should better be called patrimonial wealth because it embraces not just productive sectors of the economy, but property and natural assets, natural resources, all of which are being massively concentrated into the hands of a very small number of people. And that concentration then itself becomes a further source of wealth and power, enabling them to take even more through, in particular, economic rent, through charging people to use non-reproducible assets over which they have exclusive control, and they can basically force people to pay through the nose. And this translates into a power that becomes very hard to challenge and to confront because of its self-reproducing nature. And the only way of doing it, really, is with a full-on political assault, a political attempt to break down or break the cycle of patrimonial capital. And this is constantly rolled back and constantly thwarted by our political crisis, which is a crisis that is now long-standing. It's been running for several decades, where we see the gradual closure of political choice and political avenues. And in fact, the closure of politics itself, even to some extent of civic life itself, as party after party has succumbed to the dominant ideology of our age, neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is more than just a form of economics or a form of politics. It's a description of human life and of human nature. And it basically, its central conceit is that society should be considered as and run as a business. That the fundamental human urge is to compete. This is how they see humanity. There's no scientific evidence for it at all, by the way. But we're fundamentally hyper-competitive, selfish and greedy is what they say, and that these are virtues. And that these virtues should be mobilized to ensure that we elbow each other out of the way in order to reach a great prize, that society thereby becomes divided between winners and losers, that we can determine who the winners are because they're the ones with the money, and determine who the losers are because they're the ones without, and that gives us a scale of merit. And anything which stands in the way of that discernment of merit is antithetical to human well-being. So regulations, taxation, trade unions and the organisation of labour, civic and political life itself are seen as obstacles to the realisation of this utopia of perfect measurement and comparison. And what that says, in effect, is that politics is an invalid sphere. It's an illegitimate intrusion into what they call the market, into this business, comparative, competitive sphere where they see legitimacy to reside. And as party after party, ruling and opposition, succumbed to that doctrine, politics closed down. And then a result of that is that people had nowhere to turn but to a virulent anti-politics, demagoguery, to people who say, we stand aside from the admittedly corrupt political elites who are just self-serving and yabbering away over our heads, and all that rubbish about debate and argument is just a conspiracy against you because they've stitched it all up, which is evidently true. They've stitched it up, and so therefore politics itself is invalid. And it's all right because we're going to give you an alternative to politics where we don't do argument, we don't do debate, we don't do fact, we do slogans, symbols, sensations. And we tell you that you're the greatest, and we tell you we're going to make you great again, and we tell you we're going to vanquish your foes, and we tell you that you needn't bother with all that complexity and expertise that is just the liberal elite getting together to do you down. And so we see this rise of triumphalist demagoguery, not just in the US, but in India, in the Philippines, in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, and many other countries besides. And we see the stirrings of it in this country too. These are very dangerous times. We're talking about a multiple crisis, or multiple series of crises interlocking and reinforcing each other. So yes, I do despair sometimes. But what keeps me going is this. It's a recognition that political failure is at heart a failure of imagination. That if you're looking at the wall, not that wall in particular, but a wall, and you're failing to see the cracks in it, it's because you're not looking at it right. There are cracks in it, not that particular wall, I'm sure it's beautifully constructed, but in the wall that we confront, the great political obstacles that we confront, there are always going to be cracks in that wall. But you have to look at it from a different angle. You have to stand back. You have to envision that wall in order to see those cracks. And for that, you require political imagination. And this is where hope lies. And this sense for me has been reinforced by 4 observations over the course of the last couple of years. I can't claim that they're original to me. Some are sort of a little bit original, but they were new to me and interesting to me, and I hope some of them might be interesting to you. And the first one is the most familiar and mundane. And this is that it's not political leaders or political parties that change the world, but big political narratives. If we look at the history of the past 70 or 80 years, we see that period more or less divided in half between 2 big political narratives. The first one, Keynesian social democracy, which prevailed, well, from the end of the Second World War until the late 1970s, and the second one, neoliberalism, which prevailed from the late 70s until today. And during those periods, it didn't matter where you said you came from, what party you were from, what you claimed to stand for, where your history lay, what your name was, what your colours were. It didn't matter. You were basically, during the Keynesian era, a Keynesian, and during the neoliberal era, a neoliberal. Whether you were Labour, Conservative, Republican, Democrat, you subscribed to what seemed like common sense at the time. Even Richard Nixon is alleged to have said, "We are all Keynesians now." And there shouldn't be anything surprising about the fact that it's stories which really run the world, because we are fundamentally creatures of narrative. When we try to interpret the world, we don't look at a stream of data coming at us and say, well, the facts on this side say that, and the facts on this side say the other, and I'm comparing the data column here with the data column there, and my conclusion is such and such. We can't do that because the world is too complicated. The world was too complicated in the Paleolithic to do that, because we're confronted by this fantastic array of social interactions and ecological interactions and information coming at us left, right, and center, more than the human brain can process. The human brain itself is more than the human brain can process. And given that our minds are formed socially, that we can't form a mind alone, that we are constantly interacting with other people and receiving their streams of thought as well, the complexity becomes utterly overwhelming if you try to do it, interpret it through the sort of rationality that a scientist or a philosopher or a mathematician would recognize. Instead, we use a shortcut, a heuristic, which is narrative. And when we try to make sense of the world, the sense we're seeking is narrative sense. Does this story progress as you would expect a story to progress? Is there a beginning? Is there a middle? Is there an end? Is there a hero? And is the hero going to triumph? It's that sort of thing that we're looking for when we try to make sense of the world. The second observation is perhaps a little more interesting. It's that the stories which I've just been talking about, Keynesian social democracy and neoliberalism, have exactly the same narrative structure. They might be radically opposed to each other, they might hate each other, but they use the same narrative device to explain themselves. And this narrative structure is what I call the restoration story. And it goes like this. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by a powerful and nefarious elite working against the interests of humanity. But the hero, who might be one person or a group of people or even an institution, confronts those powerful and nefarious forces against the odds, overwhelms them, and restores order to the land. It's the Lord of the Rings story. It's the Narnia story. It's the Bible story. You hear it and see it again and again. It's constantly reproduced. And it's the Keynesian story and the neoliberal story. So the Keynesian social democratic story says disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious elite of those who have grabbed all the money. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, you saw this massively powerful cycle of patrimonial wealth accumulation, where a very small group of people became immensely rich and impoverished everybody else through huge rents, through the destruction of consumer demand, through the infliction of indebtedness on the rest of society. And this led to disorder in the form of economic, social, and political crisis, leading to the Great Depression and all the rest. But the hero of the story, the enabling state, supported by the working and middle classes, will confront that powerful and nefarious elite. And through taxation, through the construction of powerful public services and a powerful public realm, through the legislative constraint of that elite, it will, against the odds, overcome it and restore order to the land. The neoliberal story is the same and the opposite. It says disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious force of the collectivizing state, which, through crushing opportunity, also crushes freedom and individuality. It prevents people from expressing themselves, and it leads inexorably to what Friedrich Hayek, the great prophet of neoliberalism, called the road to serfdom. It will lead to totalitarian states like the Nazi state or the Stalinist state, because that is the inevitable progression of collectivism of all kinds, however benign it may seem, whether it's the British welfare state or the US New Deal. That's where it's heading. But the hero of the story, the freedom-seeking entrepreneur, will, by forcing a space in which the free market can operate, restore liberty, opportunity, individuality, to the collectivized land, and in doing so, restore order. Two different stories, one narrative structure. Which led me to the third observation, that the restoration story, this narrative structure, is a common element to almost all successful political and religious revolutions. It's not just that our minds are attuned to narrative, it's that they're attuned to particular narratives which we expect to follow through in a particular way. And this is the one that seems to work again and again in politics. Which leads me to the fourth observation, which is that the reason, despite its manifest failure, exemplified in 2008 and in so many other ways, environmental, social, political, and all the rest, neoliberalism is still with us, is that we have not produced a new restoration story with which to replace it. When Keynesianism ran into major trouble in the 1970s with stagflation, with cost-push inflation and the rest of it, the neoliberals who'd been working on their story for a generation, knowing it was going to take that long for it to mature, were able to step forward and say, here you are on a plate, an alternative. We've got a new restoration story for you. And political parties everywhere say, oh, phew, thank God for that. Thanks very much, we'll take it. Keynes had done the same in the 1930s, when that laissez-faire Victorian and Edwardian system fell apart so spectacularly with the Great Depression. It had taken a little longer, but he had sat down and in 1936 published his general theory, which again was seen as this fantastic, radical, new restoration story which would transform politics, and everybody picked it up and said, thanks very much. When neoliberalism collapsed, fell apart at the seams in 2008, when with an implosion so fundamental that even Alan Greenspan, the great promoter of the model, who had literally sat at Ayn Rand's knee as a young man, absorbing all her fabulous nonsense, even he was forced to admit that there was, as he put it, a flaw in the theory. And so the opponents of neoliberalism came forward and said, here you are. Oh, we haven't got anything. We'd spent all that time not producing a new restoration story because we did not understand the role of narrative in politics. Until we do, and do propose a new restoration story, we get stuck with the old model, however bankrupt and discredited that may be. Well, I hear you say, why can't we go back to Keynesianism? Well, going back in politics is very difficult, unless you're a fascist. Somehow they seem to be able to reinvent themselves generation after generation. I'm not quite sure how, perhaps because it's kind of outside what we consider to be politics. But in other areas of politics, it's very hard. And one of the reasons for that is that in the first iteration of your political narrative, so in what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975, in the case of Keynesianism, the opponents of that system worked like fury to find its weak points and to find the ways of bringing it down. And they did so very effectively through the destruction of capital controls, the deregulation of finance, the pulling down of fixed foreign exchange rates, the stifling of Keynes's attempt to create a balanced global trading system through his international clearing union. All of those Keynes saw as being essential elements of his system were eventually destroyed. And it's very hard now to try to do anything remotely resembling Keynesian stimulus spending and the other measures that he put forward without that enabling environment. So take the absence of capital controls. To give you just one example, in, when was it? 2008, I think it was. The Labour government, or 2009, following the great crash, said, right, we've got to stimulate the economy. We've got to get people spending again. A classic Keynesian stimulus spending measure. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring about scrappage payments so that people can take their old cars in and they'll be paid a couple of grand towards the cost of buying a new car. And that's going to stimulate employment, it'll stimulate manufacturing and assembly and all the rest of it. And then the people who are employed by that means will be able to use their money to buy more things, and that'll stimulate further consumption, which will stimulate further employment, etc. So they put £350 million into this, but there was a flaw in the theory, and the flaw was that without capital controls, and with the state aid rules and the rest of it within the European Union, you could not ensure that that money was spent in the UK. 15% of it was. 85% was spent in Germany, Japan, and other major motor manufacturing nations. We could see it as a very generous form of foreign aid to some of the richest countries on earth. It just leaked straight out. You pull the lever and you don't get the response in current circumstances. So the only way it could work would be to reimpose all those capital controls, fixed exchange rates, balanced international trading system, and the rest of it. But you know, the financial global financial powers who basically pulled it all down the first time, they know how to stop that. They've already got experience of it. They've already worked it out. It's hard to see how we could bring that back even if we wanted to. And here's the next thing. At the Keynesian system of stimulus spending, deficit spending, the purpose of it was to sustain a steady rate of growth and a steady rate of consumer demand, not too much, but not too little either, in order to ensure that employment was generated through consumption. And that would be just great. You could have your 2 to 3% growth, decent, moderate levels of growth, forever, if the planet was growing at the same rate. Unfortunately, it is not. It is not growing, it is finite. And perpetual growth on a finite planet leads to ecological crisis. 3%, which is what the IMF and World Bank thinks is a reasonable level of global growth, means a doubling every 24 years. So everything that we face now in terms of ecological crisis, looking at twice that in 24 years, 4 times that in 48 years, 8 times, 16 times. But already we're transgressing the planetary boundaries because of the level of consumer demand, the level of the consumption of the planet's resources and the pollution produced by that consumption. And dematerialization, the absolute decoupling of consumption from, or growth from resource use is a chimera. It just does not exist. It does not happen. So even if we could magically bring back a genuine Keynesian economy, I don't think we should want to. So this is the fix we're in. We need a new political narrative, one which is comprehensible, which is graspable, which fits the restoration story framework, which tells us who we are, where we stand, how we got to where we are, which gives us a vision of a better world, which tells us how we can strive towards that better world, and yet is simple enough to be immediately communicable, and is based on fact, because there's absolutely no point in retailing fairy stories. Sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But I believe there is one within our grasp. And it's early days, but this is roughly how I see it. The world has been thrown into disorder through powerful and nefarious forces, the ultra-rich and powerful, who have concentrated resources, who are driving ecological destruction, and who are basically degrading the conditions of life for the world's majority. But the heroes of the story, the ordinary people of the world, will come together and against the odds overthrow these forces by creating out of the wreckage of atomization, of alienation, of anomie, which has been imposed through the neoliberal doctrines of these powerful and nefarious forces, something entirely different, a politics of belonging, based on revitalized communities, based on the transfer of both political and economic resources to those communities based on a grassroots recapture of politics, the politics of belonging. And by these means, we restore order to the disordered land. This might take a little bit of unpacking. Now, I could go off into all sorts of places. This could be a very long lecture, but I will not try your patience or my levels of tiredness too far, and talk about one or two aspects of how I see things changing. At the local level, at the national level, possibly if we have time, at the global level. But I feel the local level is where we need to start, because one of the fundamental and greatly neglected aspects of human well-being, neglected throughout the political sphere, is belonging, is having a sense of belonging to a place, geographical belonging, very unfashionable now. I'm not talking about exclusive belonging. I'm not saying we are the people who live here and those people can't come and live here because they are alien and other. Far from it. I'm talking about a generous and inclusive sense of belonging. The alternative to belonging, to a generous and inclusive sense of belonging, is not no belonging, because everyone has a fundamental need to belong. It's a cruel and exclusive sense of belonging. This is what fascism offers. It offers you a sense of belonging. You're all marching under one flag, wearing one uniform, listening to one anthem. You belong. That's what it gives people more than anything else. In a place where they don't have it, it gives a sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself. Hannah Arendt pointed out that fascism arises from atomization, from the dust and powder of shattered communities. That when you lose something better which holds you together, you're looking around desperately, someone comes along and says, "You are the master race. We're going to give you this place where you can express the fact that you're the master race and you're going to belong to that." We have to create an alternative pole of belonging. A generous, inclusive community where anyone can belong, even if they're only living there for a few months, but they feel instantly that they can connect with the other people around them. And it's from that, I believe, that's the sort of the seed bed in which an effective politics can develop. It is not in itself the effective politics. It's the context, the environment for an effective politics. And there's now, interestingly, there's a science of how you create vibrant and coherent communities. Best summarized by a huge 400-page document, when I say summarized, commissioned by Lambeth Borough Council, surprisingly perhaps. It's a really wonderful piece of work. And what it is a survey around the world of what it calls participatory culture, of getting people together and ensuring that you spread the notion of constructive, creative community. And it says that what you've basically got to do is come in on a couple of levels at once. You have your sort of specialist, quite high threshold, high commitment activities. Your like we have at home where a bunch of us have a community orchard and we do an apple pressing every year and we make our own cider and all the rest of it, and then we get completely slaughtered on it. That's the sort of thing which requires quite a lot of commitment, quite a lot of skill levels and the rest of it, and there's quite a big hump to getting involved. You want a bit of that, but more importantly, at the same time, you need your low threshold, low commitment activities. Very, very simple things, like eating together. How many people here know the etymology of the word companion? Thank you. One or two, good. Companes, with bread. Eating together is fundamental to fellowship. It is absolutely essential element of who we are, is getting together and eat. But, what do? We sit in front of the telly with a microwave meal, not even talking to each other. Something has gone badly wrong there. But you get people together with your pay-as-you-feel cafes or sort of joint cooking sessions or whatever. in a sort of friendly space, and there's always going to be somewhere that you can beg, borrow, or steal in your community where you can do this, and you eat together. Very simple. You can greatly reduce the costs of people's food by that means. You can spread some basic cooking skills and the rest of it. Shared childcare, another classic, quite easy thing to do, which can greatly relieve the burden on people because you want things which actually make life easier rather than harder. Shared bulk buying, mending stuff together, clothes swaps, for children, all that sort of thing. Very, very simple things which anyone can get into. There's nothing scary about it, and you don't have to do it again if you don't want to do it again. And what they find is that if you get this right, and if you get about 10% of your local community participating, you get this sudden takeoff into what they call thick networking, where suddenly it becomes the norm to participate and strange not to participate, rather than the other way around, as it is at the moment. And then you get this transformative effect. And a classic example is what happened in Rotterdam starting in 2011, where some local hippies took over a disused Turkish bathhouse for a festival. They called it the Lezol, the reading room. And they would have films and plays and performances, and people could hang out and read, and there was a bar and there was a cafe. And they did it for just a week. They would just do a little festival for a week. But it's massively popular, and they were urged to keep this running. So they did. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, there's lots of parents coming in. We need a children's play area. Oh, and we need a creche for the younger ones. And what about the old people who can't come out because they're housebound? Oh, we need to have outreach to them. Suddenly, all these little satellite initiatives started budding off it. And then social entrepreneurs came in and said, oh, well, I can run a cafe on the back of this, and or I can run a transport service, and all these sort of half business, half community things started coming in. Within 5 years, that has helped to spawn 1,300 projects in Rotterdam. And this was a city with a lot of depressed areas, a lot of big intercommunal tension, a lot of unemployment, and it has just transformed it. The city council now does nothing without consulting the community groups first, because it realized that they know how to do this better than the council does. And so by pulling these people in and by saying, right, okay, show us how it's going to happen, suddenly you start to see this material transformation in people's lives, the creation of employment as well, the breaking down of barriers between people, the sort of release from suspicion and hostility towards this inclusive and generous sense of belonging. But then you can start to edge it into political transformation. And a classic example of how you can do this is very gently, very easily, is what they did in Reykjavik, where they launched this initiative for people, in effect, to take over the future of the city. And this is sort of purely at the political level, but basically they have this system now in which 2/3 of the city's population has participated, which is an incredibly high level of participation in something which requires a bit of effort, requires a bit of time, where you have this voting system where anyone can put forward an idea for changing the city. And then everyone has a chance to vote on that idea, and the most popular ones get put forward to the council. And the council, within a month, has to either accept the idea or provide a good and detailed reason for not accepting the idea. And in fact, that second bit, the good and detailed reason, turns out to be the political key, which opens this whole process. Because when you are forced not to just blithely dismiss things, but to engage intelligently with them, you give people the sense that their voice counts, that it actually matters what they say, and that making a strong, coherent argument for something is worthwhile, rather than being, as unfortunately is often our experience in this country, a total bloody waste of time. And suddenly you get this level of civic engagement which was alien before. Then you take it to the next step. And the next step is exemplified by Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, which introduced this idea of participatory budgeting. And what they've done is to give the people control of the infrastructure budget in Porto Alegre. Every year now, 50,000 people there take part in the budgeting process. They draw up the budget between them through this very clever participatory process that they have, sort of coming from the district levels and the rest of it. And it has been quite astonishing what's happened, both at the material, instrumental level, and at the broader civic and political level. So, for instance, the water now is much cleaner than in similar cities where this hasn't happened. The sanitation is much better. The nursery places, there are far more of them. The primary schools are much better. The primary health care is much better than it was. The infant mortality rate has dropped away. The mafia has disappeared. Because the way mafias get a hold in communities is to provide them with services which the corrupt local government is not providing. There's just no place for corruption anymore because everything is transparent. Clientelism has just vanished overnight. It's quite extraordinary. But here's the real kicker. People in Porto Alegre are doing something which all political theorists regarded as utterly impossible. They are lobbying for their taxes to be raised because they can see the point of this spending. They can see that a dollar or a real or cruzado, whatever the currency is now, spent publicly goes a lot further than one that you spend privately. You could, buy yourself an extra bit of parking space outside your house, or you could contribute to a public transport system which is actually going to function where you don't need it. It goes much further when it's in the public sphere than when it's in the private sphere, if you've got a responsive system of that kind. And I would argue that this is not enough. That first of all, you can extend the participatory budgeting system way beyond the infrastructure budget and way beyond the municipal level to the national level. And there's all sorts of interesting ways in which we could engage with that. But secondly, that you can extend the principle away from what we now consider to be the public sphere into what we now consider to be the private sphere, which of course is where most of the wealth currently lies and where the great maldistribution of wealth occurs. And in order to do this, we have to grasp a concept which has been woefully neglected in both economics and in politics: the commons. How many people here would feel comfortable defining the commons? About average. One, thank you. There might be another one I didn't see, but that's about average, that's fine. Don't feel bad about it because we don't talk about it. And yet the commons is one of the four pillars of the economy. When we talk politics, we basically position ourselves along one axis. It's got the state at one end, it's got the market at the other. And if you say, I'm on the left, you broadly want more state and less market. And if you're on the right, you want more market and less state. That's basically how we talk about politics and economics. But there are four sectors of the economy, primary sectors. There's a state and there's a market, and they're both important. I don't dismiss either of them. Then there's the household, the core economy, as some people call it. Absolutely essential to everything. If children are not fed and watered, are they watered? No, maybe not. If they're not fed and loved and looked after, they cannot possibly become functional adults. If adults are not loved and looked after, it's very hard to remain a functional adult. It's then very hard to participate in other economic areas. And our perennial neglect to the household has led to a perennial neglect to the crucial economic role of women because they're still the major providers within the household. So we just overlook them as being, homemakers, overlook people who are doing what should rightly be regarded as economic as well as all sorts of other spheres of work. We overlook that contribution. There's a wonderful book by Catherine Marcel called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And she explains that while the great man was writing The Wealth of Nations, his long-suffering mother, Margaret Douglas, was scurrying around, cooking his dinners, making his bed, cleaning his linen, all the rest of it, without which he would not have been able to function. He would not have been able to write the wealth of nations. But in doing so, and in describing the economy so well in some respects, he completely ignored the invisible hands of his mother. And somehow just overlooked the fact that his economy depended on her economic contribution. So that's the household. That's pillar 3. Pillar 4 is the one I want to focus on for a while now, and this is the commons. And not all that long ago, a few hundred years ago, most of the economy was the commons. And the commons can be defined as follows. There's really 3 major elements. There's a community, a particular group of people, generally, but not always, geographically placed. There's a resource that community manages, and that resource is inalienable. It can't be transferred to anyone else. And there are the rules and negotiations that the community creates for the management of that resource. This is woefully misunderstood by many people, including the biologist Garrett Hardin, who wrote this famous paper, The Tragedy of the Commons. He didn't even know what a commons was. He confused it with an open access regime, like the oceans, where anyone can go and fish and destroys the fisheries, or for that matter, the streets, where you can put your massive gas guzzler out on the streets and basically take as much space as you want, and no one's going to stop you. Those are not commons. Those are open access regimes. A commons is where a particular group controls the management of that resource. And not just in an ad hoc way, because there are further elements to it. It's inalienable, so as I say, it can't be sold or given away. It remains within the community, even if the individual members of the community obviously turn over. Its product is divided equally between the members of that community on a shared and equal basis. This is another key element of the commons. And until the 16th century in England, which is where it all began, up to that point, all the land on earth, just about, which was inhabited, could be considered a commons. It was collectively managed, decisions were made over what happened on that land by groups of people. And then in England, pretty well following the dissolution of the monasteries, it's where it really kicked off, though there were 1 or 2 instances beforehand, they really invented the idea of private property and land. It just didn't exist anywhere on earth, any more than we would consider owning a piece of air. It just wasn't considered something you could even think about. It was just totally outside of people's conceptions of how the world could be run. And through the process of enclosure, the taking in and privatization of the commons, the capture of what was once commonwealth and turning it into the wealth of one person or one family, the commons were systematically destroyed in England, and then that began to spread to Scotland, first of all. Well, no, sorry, first to Ireland, I beg your pardon. First to Ireland with devastating effects, then to Scotland with the Highland clearances, and more importantly, actually, the Lowland clearances, which very strangely we never hear about. Then to the British colonies, where the same model was rolled out everywhere. And then other countries started copying it, and it basically became eventually the global norm. And there are certain freedoms which came about as a result of this. I'm not saying it was entirely a bad thing by any means, because, for example, the whole notion of private individual rights arose from the notion of private individual property rights in land. So the push towards parliamentary democracy in England initially began with these parliamentary revolts against the crown, where you had the new landowners who were saying, wait a minute, you can't just arbitrarily confiscate our property. And then the levelers and the diggers picked this notion up and say, well, if you landowners have these private rights, individual rights, why shouldn't everybody have individual rights? And you could sort of pretty well, as Andrew Linklater does in his fascinating book, Owning the Earth, trace back that notion of individual human rights to the individual ownership of property. But it also had devastating impacts. And in fact, you could argue, especially today with this vast concentration of property wealth, which is much greater than the concentration of income wealth. If you're talking about inequality in countries like this, the real inequality is in property-based wealth, which is distinct from capital. You could see it as closing down political democracy, as well as closing down economic democracy. But it also, even from the very beginning, had devastating social and psychological impacts. I've worked, in particular, I lived in West Papua, in Brazil, and in East Africa. And in all those regions, I saw what happened to people who had just lost their land. The complete implosion of the sense of self, the complete destruction of their communities, the destruction of the sense of belonging, the destruction of their social lives, their ceremonial lives, and their very rapid descent into alienation, anomie, alcoholism, drug abuse, and mental illness. I saw this happening again and again and again among indigenous people who had lost their land. A few years after coming back to Britain, I started reading the poems of John Clare, arguably our greatest English poet, a remarkable man, a peasant, self-educated, pretty well taught himself to read and write, and wrote this beautiful, plangent, amazing poetry. And in his youth, he wrote these nature poems, and poems also describing his community and all the ceremonies around the year and all the rich community life. And they're incredibly engrossing, beautifully conceived and written poems where you have this utter sense of what it was like to look at the nightingale's nest, or what it was like to see the kids gathering cowslips in the meadows and the rest of it. And then suddenly, in mid-adulthood, everything changes. And he starts writing these really dark and distressed poems about enclosure. Poems such as The Fallen Elm and The Moors and The Ballad of Swordy Well, about the destruction of everything he knew. Not just of his community, but of the very land itself, as all the trees were felled, the lumps and bumps leveled off, everything was enclosed in order to put sheep on the field. Sheep, I tell you, are the root... Oh, sorry, wrong lecture. And basically replacing the people with sheep. That was what happened. And what happened to John Clare? He became an alcoholic. He succumbed to mental illness, and he died in a lunatic asylum. And suddenly, it occurred to me, this happened to all of us. Wherever you are in the world, the same process has taken place. And we're several generations on, sure, but we're still feeling it. Is it any surprise, having lost all that, those thousands and thousands of years of embeddedness, not necessarily in just one place, but over the generations in different places, but in which the sense of embeddedness, the sense of belonging, was fundamental to our lives? Is it any wonder we have the levels of mental health disorders and alcoholism, drug abuse, and all the rest of it we suffer now? We're like the indigenous people that I saw on 3 continents. All the world's people are like that, torn from our roots without any replacement sense of belonging. And I see as fundamental to our personal well-being, our mental well-being, social well-being, as well as to our economic and political, societal well-being, to see the revival of that neglected 4th sector of the economy, the commons. And let me give you an example of how this could take place. An example involving urban land. And by land, I don't just mean those places which are recognizably land, like parks, because you can see that's land. The really valuable land is the land you don't see because it's got stuff on top of it. Now that stuff on top of it may be bricks and mortar, but that's not where its primary value arises. A great majority of the value of those things we call buildings arises from the speculative worth of the land on which they sit. And that speculative value has not been created by the people who harvest it. It has been created, you can create a little bit of it by improvements to your buildings and the rest of it, but the great majority has been created by society as a whole. It's been created by public infrastructure, which means this becomes a valuable place to live, a valuable location, because it's all about location, because there's a good school, there's a hospital, there's nice roads connecting it, there's an electricity network and the rest of it. It's created by the other things which people are doing around it, the businesses which make this a thriving economy where there's lots of employment, all the rest of it. And yet the landowner, the freehold owner, is the one who harvests all this without making any effort. And this has been a complaint which goes all the way back to Thomas Paine and Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Winston Churchill and many other people in between, left or right. This has widely been recognized for many years as being a grave injustice. And so the result of that is the call, formulated most succinctly by Henry George, for land value taxation, for recouping that part of the value of the land on which the most valuable physical infrastructure sits, which was not created by the person who harvests it. And I think that's a very good proposal, but I don't think in itself it goes far enough, because the big question which this now begs is, what do we do with that money? And I think we can do some quite interesting things with it. So you impose a high rate of land value taxation, you're bringing in a lot of money into the exchequer. And some of that money should be spent on public services, public infrastructure, and the rest of it. That's entirely appropriate. But the residue, I believe, should be divided equally amongst community groups who are encouraged to set themselves up in urban or indeed rural boroughs in order to make use of that money. And this money is granted on certain quite stringent conditions, in terms of due diligence and fiscal responsibility, etc., but there's also a fairly limited number of things that you can do with that money, at least initially. At the same time, you get various other forms of facilitating legislation, such as a community right to buy, of the kind that they have in Scotland, and possibly also a community right to land assembly. What the communities, in other words, are being encouraged to do is to set up a community land trust, which becomes a kind of commons. And so you've got this sum of money, and you say, right, we're entitled now and enabled to buy land. What are we going to do with this? Oh, look, a casino has come up for sale. Let's buy a casino. Not because we want a casino, quite the opposite, because we don't want a casino, because we don't believe that that's the most appropriate use of that land. We're going to buy the casino, and we're going to knock it down. And we're going to put something there which is going to be far more immediately useful to people in this community, which is desperately needed, such as, for example, affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I mean affordable housing, not affordable housing. And we're going to clear this site, but then we're not going to build it. What we're going to do is go to people at the top of the social housing list, and also go to people who might want to buy a house on the site, because we want a mixed development, we don't want to ghettoise, and say, right, people who want to buy a house, here you can put a deposit down. People who want a social home, you can put your expression of interest down. You're going to come together and design not only your own homes, but with the help of professional advice, you're going to design the estate. And what you find is that when people design their own estates, and there are a few examples around the world, they do so to a far higher level and in far more imaginative ways than these off-the-peg designs which the volume house builders helicopter down, say take it or leave it, and you have to take it because you've got no sodding choice these days. These sort of repeated boxy homes which they make, you find places which actually build in the features that people might want on their estates. For instance, places for children to play. Rather than all the public space being devoted to car parking, say you have a sort of village green arrangement where the houses look onto it, the cars are all on the other side of the houses, so there's no danger to the children there. The children are safe from predatory people because everybody's overlooking the green, and they can run out and play. And you know what? When the children get together, the adults get together because they meet each other through the children, because children are quite good at talking to each other, adults are quite bad at talking to each other, so the children introduce the adults to each other. basically a community not built around children, it's very hard for that community to take off. But not only do communities tend to design much better physical estates, this process is going to take a couple of years. And by the end of that time, what do you have? You have a community. People who've been working together for a couple of years to design that estate so that when they move on, they all know each other. They might hate each other, but they all know each other. No, they probably, you had to make it work, so you have to rub along, you have to get on okay. And people who aren't going to rub along are going to drop out during the process. There might be one or two problems, but they're not going to be major. But you already have been working constructively together before you move on. Now, what land value tax has done is to bring down the price of property as a whole, quite considerably if it's a high level of land value tax, because the increment from that property is no longer going exclusively to the freeholder, but is also going into the public exchequer, so it's not nearly so lucrative to be buying up land. It brings down the price, but the community land trust is still harvesting some rent from that site. It's also still getting land value tax residue put into its exchequer. So what does it then do? Well, maybe buy up more land, create more estates, more affordable housing for people, or start investing in public infrastructure, libraries, youth centres, playing fields, whatever it might be. Or it might decide to pay a community dividend, a community basic income, payable to everyone who's there, all on a shared and equal basis, because this is a commons. But it can decide. You can immediately start to see how this proposal begins again to mutate and proliferate into all sorts of different avenues which you can't necessarily predict. It's going to have emergent characteristics because you've created a complex system as opposed to a linear process. But of course, for any of this to happen, you need a friendly political environment. It's very hard to do this if your politics is controlled by a remote elite who are basically trying to furnish the coffers of an economic elite, which unfortunately is the case in far too many countries, including our own. So you need regime change, non-violent, of course. And this might sound, again, like something very difficult to pull off, but I think there's a very interesting precedent showing how it could be done. And it comes from something that happened in the first half of 2016. Well, what possible good happened in the first half of 2016, you might ask? It was the candidature of Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination. Well, that was a total failure, wasn't it? He didn't get it. Look what happened. Trump got in. Well, bear with me a little. When Sanders first announced that he was going to be a candidate, he was completely written off by the political and media classes. It was just like, this guy's a total no-hoper, he's superannuated, irrelevant, socialist, extremist, all the rest of it. He also had 3% name recognition, not a great place to start. And he had no money, which in US politics is something of a handicap. So he and his team of 2 or 3, because he couldn't afford to pay anymore, sat down and said, well, what are we going to do? How on earth do we launch this and give it a realistic prospect of success? And the first question they asked themselves is, well, what have we got? What assets do we possess? We don't have any money, we don't have any recognition, we don't have any media, friendly media. The one thing we possess is enthusiasm. The public enthusiasm of people who want to see Bernie Sanders become president, however unlikely that currently appears. So what are we going to do with this enthusiasm? Are we going to get people into stuff envelopes, which is what political parties normally do, while basically raising loads of money from Wall Street and paying a team of consultants and staffers to do all the heavy lifting? Well, we can't afford to do that. We don't want to mess with big donors, so that's not going to be an option for us. What if we got the enthusiasts, the supporters, to do some of the jobs which the consultants and staffers would normally do? It's a bit scary. Well, we'll try it. We'll give them a little bit. See what they're... Oh, God, they nearly bit our hands off. They just mopped it up. Oh, we'll give them a bit more. Oh, blimey. And what they found very quickly was that the more you asked people to do, the more enthusiastic they became. That a big ask creates big enthusiasm. That if you just tell people you want them to knock on doors or stuff envelopes, you'll get a few die-hard political junkies will come and help out. But if you say, we want to give you what they call a big organizing role, because this is what they call them, what they were doing, big organizing, then people are desperate to do it. And suddenly, they were able to farm out all sorts of stuff which they never imagined that volunteers could do. And they quickly discovered that 4 or 5 volunteers equals 1 staffer. Because these aren't full-time people and there's a steep learning curve to acquire the skills, but they get there very quickly. And what you've got when you've got 4 or 5 volunteers is resilience. If your staffer goes ill, you've lost a major plank in your campaign. If you've got 4 or 5 volunteers, one goes ill, you've still got 4 people who can keep the thing together. And then someone had the bright idea of, well, why are we training these people? Why don't we get the first wave of volunteers to train the next wave of volunteers? Blimey, that works. They're just as good as we are. Oh my gosh, we're doing ourselves out of a job. They instantly were able to train the next wave of volunteers, who then very quickly were able to train the next wave. And this was a great big live experiment, basically, because with the exception of sort of 1 or 2 forays into this, like the Yes campaign in Scotland, for instance, it hadn't really been done like this before, but it just started taking off. By the close of the nomination process, Sanders had gone to absolute no-hoper to having 46% of the vote, 22 states in his pocket. His volunteers, he'd had 100,000 volunteers who ran 100,000 public events themselves and spoke directly to 75 million Americans. They reckon that with another month, they could have spoken to every accessible adult in America, face to face. Not some professional pollster with a clipboard, but someone from your own community, someone who says, I don't just know your pain, I feel your pain because I'm in exactly the same spot as you are, which is so much more persuasive and engaging than professional involvement. And what you saw as they began, tragically too late, to understand the potential of this model and to see what could be done was this sudden, the Sanders popularity ratings were doing this, and they started doing this, and then were doing that. And just at the cut-off point, basically, it was looking like a total takeoff. Another couple of weeks, no doubt in my mind at all, Sanders would have won the nomination. And given that, unlike Barack Obama, he understood that you don't dump your volunteer army when it's no longer useful to you, but you keep it going forever. There's no doubt that he would have marched the election, and Donald Trump would not be president now. And that he would have sustained the mobilizing, revolutionizing power of what he had once he was in office. Well, I read a book by 2 of Sanders' organizers called Rules for Revolutionaries, describing this big organizing model. And as it happened, a few weeks after I read this, Theresa May called the general election, the surprise snap election. And if you remember, the great debate among the political pundits at the time was, is the Conservative majority going to be 100 or 120? How big is the landslide going to be? That was the only serious debate there was to be had. But I'd read this book and I thought, I don't believe there's no way out of this for Labour. I believe this is a way out. And so I asked The Guardian if I could make a little video basically saying this is what Sanders did. If Labour do the same, there's a possibility they could even clinch this election. Well, it's a rule of mine which I break every week, never to read the comments underneath an article or a video you make. But I have this sort of fatal attraction towards them. I'm so hypnotized, I can't help seeing what people have to say. And in this case, I reminded myself of why I have this rule, which I always break. There wasn't a single positive comment. I mean, Monbiot has really jumped the shark, looped the loop, completely got off his rocker this time. This is completely crazy. Those were the more friendly ones. And I read these and thought, oh God, what have I done? What an idiot. Talk about wishful thinking. Little did I know that as I was making this video, and this had nothing to do with me, the Labour Party and Momentum had brought over Sanders organisers to teach them how to do it. And they had totally got it and totally adopted that model and had already started to push it out and proliferate it in the very short period that they had. You know, they had 6 weeks to roll that out. And despite that remarkably short period, they managed to get to loads and loads of people who had never properly spoken to a political campaigner before, people within their own communities. And again, they refined the model and fed it back into the US system as well. And we saw the result, the biggest surprise in British democratic history. Turning this around from a situation where Corbyn was a total no-hoper. It was going to be a complete wipeout. Labour was going to be in the political wilderness for a generation, if not forever, to depriving the Conservatives of their overall majority. This strong and stable government in the national interest, which we're all enjoying today, just evaporates. And again, a couple more weeks, it's quite likely that they would have clinched it. The power of big organising. Now, it seems to me that if you bring together the power of this remarkable political community with its sense of political belonging and its emergent, proliferating qualities that the big organising model gives us, with a new restoration story which embeds and frames that political model and creates the template, the basis for a vision of a better place that lights a path towards a better world, then we become unstoppable.